Good morning and welcome to Global Perspectives. I'm David Dumke. Today we're joined by Dr. Rosalind Beiler, who is a professor of history at UCF, who does a lot with digitizing old letters of migrants coming to the United States. I'm going to let you explain it because it's a fascinating project. It's called PRINT. Yes. Tell us a little about PRINT.
Okay. So PRINT stands for People, Religion, Information, Networks, and Travel. And it's about the dynamics of migration in the early modern world. And actually, to tell you about this project, I want to start with how I got there.
Sure.
Because I'm a migration historian. I work on the migration of people to the British colonies, actually before we were the United States. And I was working on a project on a man named Caspar Worcester, who migrated to Pennsylvania in 1717 and became a Quaker. And I had a collection of family letters for him, which is really unusual for people who are German-speaking migrants in this time period. And as I was going through his letters, there was one in particular. By the time he was writing this letter, it was the 1730s, and he was writing to a business partner in a little town close to Heidelberg. And he asked his business partner to go to a man named Jakob Schnebly. And Jakob Schnebly, so in the early modern period, we identify people mostly through church records because that's where vital statistics were kept. So as I was trying to identify everyone in these letters, I could identify his business partner as an elder in the Reformed Church. And so he wrote to his business partner and said, please go to Jakob Schnebly, who I could identify as an elder in a Mennonite or an Anabaptist church. And he said, ask him to find people who are migrating to Pennsylvania so that they can carry the rifles that I custom ordered from you as a part of their household belongings in their chests. And so basically he was asking his business partner to have Jakob Schnebly find people to smuggle these guns for him, right? And he said, ask Jakob Schnebly because he knows all the people who are migrating. And so the project that I'm working on now sort of came out of questions from that story. I wondered, first of all, why was a Quaker asking a Mennonite? Those are both really pacifist groups
for
today,
guns,
right?
Yeah,
I was
for
guns,
thinking that
right?
Myself, yes.
So what's the story there? And then the other question for me was, why is it that it was the Mennonite elder who knew all the people who were migrating to Pennsylvania in this period? And so the gun running story I have to save for another day. But that anecdote really got me to thinking about who the people were in Worcester's letters. And many of them were religious minorities. They belonged to these dissenting religious groups in the period. And what I bumped into and what I began to uncover were correspondence networks. He was using them for his business purposes, but they were all dissenters. They were all these religious minorities. And so that led me to the research project that forms the foundation for PRINT. So what I'm looking at in that research project is these correspondence networks that emerge in the 17th century. And they emerge as people who belong to these religious groups are being persecuted and begin to correspond with people across political, cultural, social, economic borders, if you will. And so, for instance, in the 1630s and 40s, there were Dutch Anabaptists who began to correspond with fellow believers in Switzerland who were being forced into exile, were being banished because of their religious beliefs. And they began to correspond regularly to help them. First, they were lobbying to try to gain religious toleration, and then when that failed, they helped them to resettle in other areas of Europe. In the 1650s, Quakers from Scotland and England, who themselves were being persecuted, began to correspond to one another, and they also began to visit Anabaptist and Pietist people in Europe who they thought might be open to their version of the truth. So they began to send missionaries out. And as they did so, they began to correspond regularly. And so they created these communication networks that were overlapping and intersecting and really acted almost like a kaleidoscope, right? They were overlapping and intersecting and ultimately become channels for information about migration possibilities. So what I began to find was that by the early 1700s, these networks were no longer about religion at all, but they took on a life of their own as people with different interests began to send information through them. So people like William Penn, who was trying to promote his colony, used these same connections to send promotional literature, to recruit colonists. Heads of state, like the English Queen and the Prussian King, used the same networks to recruit people for areas that were devastated by war. And then merchants began using them, like Worcester, for their own business purposes, right, as well. And the migrants themselves were seeking better opportunities. So what I was arguing, and what I am arguing in that project, is that ultimately these networks provide sort of the dynamic for shifting migration flows to the British colonies. But print started because I was having a really hard time visualizing these networks. They're not really stable networks. And so people were constantly moving. The connections between people were constantly shifting. And when one person dropped out, the whole constellation of connections changed. So I couldn't visualize them on a two-dimensional page, which is what I set out to do. So the project started to solve that visualization problem. So what we're doing with the project is we are creating a digital collection of letters, of correspondence. We have about 3,000 letters of Quakers, Anabaptists, and Pietists, and we're creating a portal to these letters so that users will be able to come to the collection and query it, and the returns will come as a series of visualizations. So the visual, yeah, go ahead.
I'm trying to, it's hard to kind of capture this, obviously, in interview form, but what are some of the things they're going to both see and learn through these letters?
Right, so through these letters. So the thing that I love about these letters is that many of them are either from or to or about ordinary people, right? So they're going to learn lots of things. If you're interested in issues of religion, which they're all religious minorities, you can learn all about why people are moving and what they believe. The Quakers were, all of these groups, they're on the radical side in this time period. They're not being tolerated, and they're pretty in your face. So you get to see, what they're doing in terms of their religious beliefs. But what really fascinates me is the stories of ordinary people that show up, right? Sure. So, for instance, in the Quaker letters, we have a set of Quaker letters from a family, the Pembertons, who end up migrating to Pennsylvania. And in those letters,
a massive project in the Pembertons, I believe.
Yes. So, we have a collection of 460 letters, right, from and to this family and their friends. And so for my purposes, you get to learn about the whole migration process, because they're writing, some of the letters write about the experience of being on board ship and leaving, but they're also writing about what it's like to settle in a colony in a new place that they come over with Penn in the 1680s, and so it's a brand new place. But then there's also this very human story that's a part of it, right? So there's one letter where a father is writing to his teenage daughter. She's 17, Abigail, and her mother has just died, and she's basically running the household and looking after all of her younger siblings. And he writes to her, and he basically is chiding her because she hasn't done the right thing with the cider that he sent to have delivered in Philadelphia from their farm. And yet at the end, he talks about how much he loves her and what he's proud of, right? So you get to see all of these different human stories in these letters.
So much of our history is read through political or military leaders, or sometimes artists, or literature, but not the common people or the day-to-day life.
Yes.
What made you interested in kind of uncovering that side of history?
Oh, well, the human stories, that's what's always fascinated me about history. I mean, I'm interested in culture. I'm interested in how people adapt to new situations and new places. And yes, we always act within political contexts, but I've always, for as long as I can remember, that's just what I'm interested in, right? I think that it's we as ordinary people, our daily decisions that ultimately create those big political events, right? It's a bunch of small decisions by ordinary people.
So let me ask you, you're describing, that they were quite radical in terms of their religious beliefs, which religious and kind of political beliefs kind of blended, and that's what led to the migration for many, if not most of them, to begin with. But what are some of the things that surfaced in their letters of like what were their concerns on a day-to-day basis?
Their concerns were much like ours. Making sure that they could put food on the table, right? Their concerns were about their families and making sure that their families were okay. Some of the documents we have, these are not necessarily letters, but as I was looking to try to identify people in the letters, the ways in which we can find out about ordinary people is because in the case of the Anabaptists in Switzerland, they were being persecuted. And the government in Zurich confiscated their farms and then tracked every single year how they spent the proceeds, the profits from those farms to care for the family members who were imprisoned, to care for or to feed the family members who were imprisoned, and then to care for all of the children and the grandchildren of the parents who were imprisoned. And so you get to see these stories of family separation, and I think that people then, much like we today, we care about our lives and making sure that we have a secure place to be and making sure that we can feed ourselves and our friendships and our families. I think that clearly sort of bubbles up in these letters.
Do they capture both? I mean, obviously, when you have people who are going from a place, usually they're seeking a better life, obviously, in almost all cases.
Yes.
That's true today as well as it was then. But in seeking a better life, it also can be very disorienting.
Yes.
So what are some of the things that were disorienting among these people? They're coming from towns and villages in Europe. Often they come to a place where not everyone speaks the same language, number one. Very different scenery.
Yes. So I think that it's very disorienting, right? And again, I'm going to use the Anabaptists as one example. These are Swiss farmers. They don't want to leave home, and they try for decades. But whenever things get too hot and the authorities come after them, they sort of disappear across the borders, and then they sort of filter back in. And when they do leave, it's very disorienting for them. In their case, we don't have that many letters from them. It's a little bit different from the Quakers who come over here. But they end up resettling, some of them in the Netherlands, and they can't understand the language, and the Dutch can't understand them, and they wear different clothing, and so it's not easy, right? And then oftentimes they settle in other places for a short period of time, but they can't own property. Or, one of their issues is they are pacifists then, and they don't want to serve in the military. And so they gain sort of certain rights to live on the estates of landed nobles for a period of time, and they gain religious toleration, but they can't continue that. And so when the next elector or prince comes into power and changes the rules, then they leave again. So there is this sort of repeat migration of moving from one place to another, and every time it's a new culture and it's a new place, and they're having to start over.
In the colonies themselves, you had different colonies are run in different ways, and they drew different religious factions.
Yes.
I understand. I lived in Maryland for a while, and that had a very different history.
It did, indeed.
So do you see this through the letters then?
You see this to a certain extent. What I will say is that, I started out looking at colonial North America, but this project actually is more about Europe than it is about the American side. So I kept going back from Worcester. So Worcester was the project that I was working on that was really more on the American side. And I kept going back. And so many of the letters that we have are in the period where it's not the case for the Quakers, who often end up here, but for both the Pietists and the Anabaptists, they're not necessarily coming here immediately. They eventually get here, but these letters are more about their migration within Europe. Right? And so, but it does. I mean, they end up coming originally, most of the people I'm looking at, to Pennsylvania because William Penn is a Quaker and offers certain incentives, among which are inexpensive land and religious toleration. And, you know, that's very much targeted through these communication networks to people who are suffering because they don't have the option to own land and they don't have the option to practice their religion, you know, freely. They can within limits where they're at in the Palatinate.
So let's draw back to the print project.
Yes.
And thank you for all that background and obviously the very fascinating information about the people who wrote these letters to begin with. What are the conditions of these letters? Is this, I mean, it sounds like an elaborate hunt for these, and I imagine they're not in very good condition. So part of this project is very much preserving these, so they're there forever, but also you're making them come to life in a certain sense.
Yes, I think to me, one of the most important aspects of this project is making them accessible. So the letters are actually held in 5 repositories in 4 countries, and they're in 3 languages. So they are held in the Netherlands, in Germany, in the US, and in the UK. And they're in English, Dutch, and German. And so, and all of them are held by institutional repositories today. So they've been gathered by these religious institutions, and that's the reason we still have them. Even though I'm really interested in all of the other stories they tell, right? The letters themselves are in really varying degrees, you're right, of conditions of preservation. But the other thing that we have to do to make them accessible, they're all handwritten. And so they're all manuscript letters that are handwritten. If you look at an English letter from the 1700s or the 1600s, it looks nothing like the English we write today, right?
Right.
And the same is true for Dutch and German. They have their own paleography, their own style of handwriting from the time period. Nobody used standardized spelling. So there are all kinds of challenges to making them accessible. So what we're doing is we're working with those archivists at the repositories to have them scanned, and then we obtain the digital copies, but in order to make them searchable and legible and accessible, every one of them has to be transcribed. The Dutch and German will be translated into English. And then we're also creating metadata, and that is all the cataloging information that we need in order to make them searchable. And we are taking the names of all of the people and the places in the letters, and we're creating linked open data. And that's essentially networking the people in our database to people who show up in letters in other digital projects, so that a researcher can come and know that Phineas Pemberton in a letter in our collection is the same Phineas Pemberton as one in the British Library, for instance, right? So to do that, we've received a big grant from the National Archives, and we have an amazing team of students who are going through and creating all of the cataloging information for the letters, but they have to learn how to read them. And so they learn how to read them and transcribe them and turn that data all into something that's machine readable and searchable.
So the print as you go forward, there's no real end date. You're going to be doing this continually.
Yes.
You've found the project of your life, and it'll continue
indeed,
forever.
Indeed.
How big is your team, and how do you, it sounds so complicated to put all this together. So
it is complicated to put it all together, and I have to say, I would not have a project if it weren't for my fellow colleagues at the Center for Humanities and Digital Research. In fact, Dr. Amy Giroux is the reason the project exists at all. We met, and I was talking about having trouble visualizing my networks, and she said, "Oh, you should do a digital project," and I was like, I can't do that. So she has the sort of technical expertise, and Dr. Brooke Miller, they have the technical expertise, and I have the content knowledge, right? So we have a team at the moment. There are about 20 students, but it's varied. We started out with, a few people here, a few people there, and we keep adding to it. But we have a team of students who we're paying through this grant, who are our digital archive assistants, basically, who are helping to create the metadata. And so within our team, we have subgroups, and we have a research team for each collection of letters. In some cases, there are two. There are multiple research teams for each repository, where they are becoming really familiar with the people and the letters, and now we're moving into their doing research in order to figure out exactly who is who. But we also have to standardize all the names. In some cases, people are writing, I'm fascinated by languages. So in some cases, people are writing across languages. The Dutch Mennonites, for instance, they would receive these letters from the Swiss Germans, and they would translate them into Dutch. And so names would be rendered in Dutch and in German and sometimes in English. And you have to figure out who is who and how are we going to standardize? Lots of it. And that's the fun part of it for me. It's detective work.
How much is this? The actual process is fascinating itself,
Yes.
but I'm also, as someone who loves history, I'm fascinated by the impact too.
Yes.
Who is most interested in your work?
That's a really good question. So when I think about impacts, I think about them in sort of three different levels, right? One is other scholarly historians, and there I think that my work will help to sort of show what came before the history that historians who've written about German-speaking immigrants to the British colonies in the 18th century, which was the first sort of mass migration. This shows the dynamic networks that led to what others have written about. So that's the sort of scholarly debate. I think that this project will ultimately provide access to documents that will allow for many, many different kinds of scholarly debates, because there are so many different aspects that show up in these letters, right? It's not just about migration. You could look at family relationships, you could look at economics, you could ask many different questions about them. So there's the scholarly impact. But I'm also really hoping that when these letters are available, they will be of interest to citizen scholars and to families who are working on or people who are working on their family genealogies, right? So one of the things that we're doing in order to transcribe them is that we're crowdsourcing the transcription of the letters. So we don't have the capacity to transcribe 3,000 letters. And we also don't have the capacity to translate German and Dutch letters here among our student body. And so we are putting the letters up on a platform called Zooniverse, which is a crowdsourcing platform. And citizen scholars, anybody from across the globe, can come online and transcribe letters. And so since February of 2023, we've had like 1,300 people come and transcribe our letters.
Has the quality been consistent, or is that something you have to monitor constantly?
We'll have to monitor that.
Yeah.
So the way that Zooniverse works is that you transcribe line by line, and after lines have been transcribed 3 times, then they're retired, and then we will export them, and we have to go through and correct. But we do that with our own. We started piloting these processes. I started piloting them in the classroom and teaching students how to read, and then our team started transcribing, right, letters. And basically we've always had 3 different copies, 3 different sets of eyes, and then a 4th person looks at it, and we do the best we can. So, even having read these handwritings since the 1990s, there are still times when it's like, oh, I missed that word. That now means, I can see it means something else. Because we learn more about the context, and as you learn more about the context, then you can identify the content of the letters in different ways.
This may be a simplistic question, but I think I'm curious about it. Is there more interest in the work from where people immigrated to than where they immigrated from, or is there equal interest on both sides?
That's really interesting. I don't think I know the question to that yet. So our portal is not yet built and is not yet available to the public. I will say that I have done workshops and presented to European audiences and to American audiences, and there's a great deal of interest in both cases about the content itself. But then it's also really interesting as a digital project, and there are a lot of really interesting challenges that we're overcoming. One of the challenges is that visualization. So there were sort of 3 visualization problems.
Please explain a little about the visualization.
Yes, so the visualization problems that we're trying to solve, one is that the networks aren't stable. So, people are constantly shifting. The networks, the connections are constantly shifting. And so I wanted to show how they change over time, right, which is hard to do in a static form. But then the other is I wanted to show movement across space because I'm interested in migration, right? So I really am, and we have a mapping team who's working on it even as we speak, a computer science senior project mapping team. They are finding ways to take the network visualizations that our computer science senior project networking team just finished, and they're going to be able to show, visualize the networks on historic maps from the period, which is not an easy task because historic maps you can't geolocate the information to them like you can today, right? And then the third thing that I wanted to do with the visualizations was to show more than just simply the religious connections. So I wanted to be able to show users, allow them to choose what kinds of connections they wanted to see between people, and then to drill down and see the original documents. So all of those things are creating challenges digitally, right, in terms of the technology, to be able to create, first of all, the infrastructure, the database, but then the portal to that database, to have the networks visualized in a dynamic kind of way that shows change over time, movement across space, and allows you simultaneously to, click on a point that represents a sender of a letter and drill down to get a biography of that person, or click on a line that represents a letter between a sender and receiver and drill down and see the letter itself and its contents, yeah.
So we're running out of time, unfortunately.
Okay.
I've really enjoyed the conversation. So I got one more brief question. It could be answered in long form, but we only have time for brief answer. And that is, history is not just set. It's not static. It's always changing, and this project obviously is making it alive. Is that an accurate description?
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think that's why in some ways it's hard for me to try to judge how it's going to impact people on which side of the ocean, right? Because I think that by making these letters accessible, people are going to come with their own questions, and they will be able to find new sets of answers. And obviously, the kinds of questions and answers that they can ask and receive are limited by the data that we have accessible, right? And that data is collected by institutions. So, it still is, it's curated in a very particular kind of way. But my hope is that people will bring their own questions, and history is always ongoing. And, we'll learn all kinds of new things as a result.
Dr. Beiler, this is a fascinating project, and thank you for joining us today and explaining it.
Thank you for the opportunity, David.
And thank you for joining us. We'll see you again next week on another episode of Global Perspectives.